I am going to defer a little bit telling my personal story until after I do a brief reveal, a little bit, just flavor of game B. Then I'm going to tell my life story in short. And particularly as Thomas asked me to do, focus in on the epiphanies, the transitions in life that led me to be doing what I'm doing. And then we'll have time to answer questions, chat about whatever anybody wants to. I'm going to use a form of presentation, which I have enjoyed sometimes in the past, which I created for this chat, which is very few words. I think only one slide has any words that I'll sort of read. And I basically just put pictures up to kind of inform me. So, why are we worried about game A and game B? In the game B space, we often talk about the world being in a metacrisis, lots of things going on that are not good trends. For instance, the upper left, there's a picture of how income inequality has gone crazy in the United States since 1975. The bottom 50% have had a very modest pay raise. The top 0.01% have had almost a 700% pay raise since then. Suicide rates are increasing among youth at a staggering rate. It's a crazy rate. For the 15 to 19-year-olds are up 48%. Again, this is in the United States. And the United States suicide is the second leading cause of death amongst 10 to 24-year-old. Lower left, this is our 9 planetary boundaries. We're already over 7 of them, and with unknown consequences. And then in the lower, the Ukraine war has brought back the risk of nuclear annihilation. Oh, isn't that great? This is from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, their famous doomsday clock. They've now set it to 90 seconds before midnight, which is the closest to midnight it's ever been. So what does this have to do with us? That's supposed to be a black swan and then a gray swan. So the old black swan maybe not be quite so rare as a black swan. And what might that lead to those of us who have been successful in game A and built up significant net worths, etc.? It could turn ugly. It has in the past, and we're reaching levels of inequality and turbulence that anything can happen, including the mob going crazy and lopping heads. So keep that in mind as one of the risks that has to be in your risk management portfolio thinking, not just alpha and beta, but what about discontinuous change? What about the black swan or the gray swan? What can you do about trying to minimize the chances of that really ugly outcome? Now, we'll talk a little bit about theory in game B. We try to apply complexity science to thinking about what's going on. And we talk about the current state of a civilization as an attractor basin. You can think of it as a very high dimensional representation of everything in society that in some sense mutually reinforces the state of being of that society. Another analogy I often use is think of it as like a metal salad bowl as the high dimensional representation of where the society is, and a marble, round metal object in the bowl. And as you move the bowl around, the marble goes up and down and around. But if you move the bowl too much, or if there's too big of a shock to it, the marble could fly out. And I would suggest that all those shocks we're talking about and others have moved us to that red arrow there, which says we've come pretty far out of our stable attractor, and we're now in at or near the unstable region where we could transition to another attractor basin relatively easily. Well, that might be good or it might be bad. Unfortunately, there are some bad pre-existing attractors. The ones I tend to focus on, this is by no means list, is neo-fascism. Let's call that the Chinese model. They claim to be Marxist-Leninists, but they're actually much more like fascists. Neo-feudalism, this is from a slideshow a while ago, but the Koch brothers were big in the United States. Think Peter Thiel today, where people with lots of money will tell others, will control everybody absolutely in a feudalist structure. Think about that as neoliberalism or libertarianism taken to its logical conclusion. Neo-Dark Ages. We have religious fundamentalists of various sorts around the world. They'd love to come to power. And if they do, we could have a new Dark Age. We could have endogenous collapses like the financial system in 2008 almost had. And who knows how close we are to that right now. And collapses due to environmental issues or exogenous events like a solar flare that knocks the grid out. And so anyway, there are a number of places where the marble could fly out of the bowl and land in a worse place. So the whole idea of game B is to build a good attractor, a good place for the marble to land when we move from current attractor, game A, into the unstable region, and then we need to build an attractor to fall into, which we call game B. Game A, of course, is trying to do something about this because there are people who realize that things aren't good. And in particularly with respect to climate, one of the more challenging conditions for game A. Unfortunately, I call them Davos man. Of course, some of them are women too. Davos persons. What they want to do is pound on people less, less, less. That's really all they're saying. We need to do less, everybody, of course, except for themselves. They fly in on their private jets and stay in the fancy resorts and all that stuff. But for the regular person, less, less, less. That's their answer. And what's the result of that? Well, there's the yellow jacket movement in France, where a relatively modest intervention to attempt to put some carbon tax on diesel fuel led to riots in the street. The rise of populists like Orban in Hungary and the great Cheeto in the United States, who may be making another comeback. And if all you offer the people is less, 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 they're going to rebel and they're going to fall to the demagogic populace. I think that's a very high probability. So what's the nature of this fifth attractor, as I sometimes call game B? First and foremost, we have to commit ourselves to living within planetary boundaries while increasing human well-being, avoiding existential risks, nuclear war, runaway AIs, nanotech, bio-innovations that produce killer viruses, all kinds of things, and do so without sacrificing liberty, technological and social progress, and pluralism. And at the end of the day, it's going to require a massive cultural change, and we get there via a spiral where we increase human capacity, deprogram ourselves from a lot of the game A we call malware, bad ideas that we have grown up with. And at the same time, we start to create new institutions. And this is one of, I think, the most important insights of game B so far, because in the early days of game B, we almost came to blows over personal change first or new institutions first. And then fortunately, over time, we had a synthesis and said, of course, you need both. There's only a very few people who can make personal change stick by themselves. Fortunately, there's a small number of us maniacs, 1 or 2% of the population, who can make big changes and stick to them, despite the fact that the world hasn't changed. But for most people, they are in a resonance with the institutions and the other people around them. So you need to create new institutions that support and stabilize the personal change. Then the reality is there's only so much you can do with new institutions until the people develop new capacities, new capabilities. One of the key ones we call sovereignty, when we can get people to actually be independent people again and not just these puppets for the marketeers, essentially. And the two then spiral together. As we get more capacity in the individuals, we can build new institutions, better institutions, which help stabilize the change in the people and help draw them up to a new level. And so we can spiral up to more capable people and more efficacious institutions. And we can do so in part, at least, by being quite explicit about our virtues and our values and our norms and taking those seriously. Now, when we talked about Davos man saying less, 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 this is a very simple cartoonish view of how game B responds to that, which is we do need, in the West at least, to have less energy and less material inputs in our way of living. Very rough sketch in places like the United States, Canada, and Australia, which are the 3 highest energy and material inputs. We need to cut it by about 2/3. And we say, even though how do you measure it? I don't know. We're saying we want to reduce our energy and material inputs, but in return for less, we're going to want to provide more in terms of human well-being. Something that looks something like this. Doing. So at the end of the transition, while we're consuming 1/3 of the materials and energy that we were before, human well-being because we've organized society very differently and no longer driven by the game A ratchet of money on money return and psychological conditioning and competition around status, etc. People will actually be better off. And if we can communicate this in a believable way and actually start to deliver on it, then we won't necessarily have the reaction that would be the case with Davos man pounding on people and then going to the demagogues. And Sebastian, you set me up for this. At the same time, over the long haul, while countries like the US, Canada, and Australia need to reduce their inputs by a factor of 3, and the number on the left column is continuous watts, the amount of power that a civilization consumes, which people like Nate Hagens, who I know you guys have had on and others have pointed out, it's a simplistic but relatively powerful metric for the consumptiveness of a society. And keep in mind, it is a caricature, and we actually have to worry about all the inputs, but it's a good place to start one's thinking. And so in sub-Saharan Africa today, countries are around 500 watts, the US, Canada, Australia about 11,000 to 12,000 watts, if you also include the implicit energy in their inputs from other countries. And a rough calculation by some people who I've asked to do the calculation say that if the learning curves on zero or low carbon technologies advance at the rate we think they should, we ought to be able to converge to about a 3,500 to 4,000 watt society safely at zero carbon before the end of the century. I looked up in the league tables of countries and said, who's around 3,500 watts? Well, it turns out Portugal. I know Portugal is not a hellhole by any means. Portugal is a quite nice country. And so if we could, and Portugal is not optimized for its energy consumption. So we could imagine having a standard of living for everybody on Earth, and this is the key, that's about the same as Portugal's, probably better because technology will advance in material science, etc. And so what the deal we would suggest is over the next 60 years, bring everybody else up in the world to about 3,500, transition everybody that's above 3,500 today down to 3,500, and we all meet at a level of approximately equal energetic and material intensity in our civilization as we then proceed to go forward with the human race. And so how do we do this? I mean, I'm going to go through this very rapidly. We believe we have to build from the bottom up first, and then from the top down, unlike Davos man. And so we believe we need to start with actual communities on the ground, which we call proto-bees, and there's some other communities on the ground types as well, that they will then organize into membranes of multiple of them who will coordinate with each other, and they'll create institutions to improve their own ease and efficaciousness, that there'll be different classes of these organizations which will cluster together for different purposes. Imagine the upper blue circle as being a geographic orientation, and the lower left big circle being, say, a manufacturing specialty. Imagine these are furniture producing proto-bees, and they organize both geographically and across their specialties and any other way they want into a kind of it's not a formal hierarchy, it's a very elaborate stack of interrelationships from the bottom coming up. And then you could also imagine that there are other entities of a game bee sort in a geographic area, in addition to the proto-bees. They could all join together into a regional grouping, build some new institutions. And then we could even build, bioregional and then eventually nation state containers of these things, building upward, and then build a series of protocols to allow them to interoperate with each other to build an inside the membrane economy and culture, essentially, while at the same time competing outwardly with game A and beating game A in specific areas where we choose to compete. And by doing so, bringing resources from game A into game B until game B grows from tiny to big enough to start to tip the system, which complex systems thinkers believe is somewhere between 5 and 15%, particularly when we move into a system where there is decreasing support from the masses, essentially. If there's 15% who have a strong vision and are actually living what they say, there's a fair reason to believe that's enough to tip the system into this new basin of attraction. So that's game B in a very, where the hell do I turn? very short, hand wavy kind of fashion. There's a lot more to it. I recently gave a pitch on Game B to some potential funders. Took me 5.5 hours, not counting a 90-minute working lunch. I'm not going to inflict that on you guys today.